May 1945. At the shattered Tungamunda Bridge over the Elbe, tens of thousands of German soldiers and civilians rushed west, not to fight, but to surrender to the Americans. They feared the Soviets more than death itself. And when they finally reached US lines, what awaited them wasn't brutality, but hot coffee, white bread, and a mercy that left them stunned. May 4th, 1945. Elbe River, Germany. The sky hung low and grey over the twisted wreckage of the Tungamunda Bridge. What had once been a proud steel span across the Elbe was now nothing more than bent beams and shattered concrete, destroyed weeks earlier by retreating German engineers. Yet on this day, it was alive again, groaning under the desperate footsteps of thousands of men and women fleeing east to west. The bridge was no longer a bridge, it was a jagged skeleton, a perilous path, where planks of wood and bent iron rails had been thrown together by human hands desperate for survival. German soldiers, once the disciplined backbone of Hitler's war machine, now moved across it in single file, heads down, clutching whatever possessions they still carried: rifles without ammunition, bread wrapped in torn blankets, small radios hidden in coats. Behind them came civilians, mothers pushing baby carriages, elderly men with canes, children too tired to cry. On the western bank, American soldiers of the 405th Infantry Regiment watched through binoculars. Captain William Patterson lowered his field glasses and rubbed his eyes. The scene before him did not look like war, it looked like an exodus. He saw officers still wearing their decorations, walking with dignity even as they surrendered. He saw teenage boys, barely 14, shuffling along with Volkssturm armbands. He saw women in Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms holding hands as they crossed, afraid of what waited behind them if they turned back. American intelligence had already intercepted the signals. Massive German units were abandoning their positions. An estimated 100,000 military personnel and civilians were trying to reach American lines, funneling across this single broken crossing. What no one in Washington or London had planned for was this: an enemy not fighting, but running toward capture. Why? The answer lay not in strategy, but in raw human survival. Everyone on that bridge knew the truth, whispered from soldier to soldier, from village to village. If you fell into Soviet hands, you had a coin toss's chance of seeing home again. If you reached the Americans, you had a chance to live. For months, the Red Army had stormed westward with overwhelming force, 20 Soviet divisions for every German division still capable of fighting. Refugee columns from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia had seen entire towns burned, civilians executed, women brutalized. German soldiers had intercepted Soviet communications predicting that fewer than 4 out of every 10 German prisoners would ever return alive. Some units had even received orders to shoot their own men, rather than let them fall into Soviet hands. Now, with the war collapsing, survival meant one thing only: reaching the Americans before the Soviets reached you. On that broken bridge, the once proud Wehrmacht was no longer an army. It was a flood of humanity: officers, nurses, engineers, cooks, boys, and old men, all pushing westward toward the faint promise of mercy. And on the far bank, the young GIs of the 102nd Infantry Division braced themselves. They had food, water, medical supplies, and orders to process thousands of prisoners. But none of them could imagine what was about to come. By nightfall, that shattered bridge would carry the weight of the largest voluntary surrender in Western history. The men on that bridge were not just fleeing a lost war. They were doing the cold arithmetic of survival. By late April 1945, the choice for every German soldier and civilian was brutally simple: go east and likely die, or go west and perhaps live. German military intelligence had already gathered chilling statistics from the Eastern Front. Of every 100 soldiers captured by the Red Army, fewer than 40 would ever return home. The rest would vanish into prison camps, into forced labor in Siberia, or into unmarked graves. In truth, the survival rate would turn out even worse. The stories traveled faster than official orders. Word came from East Prussia, where entire villages had been erased during the Soviet advance. Farmers spoke of thousands of civilians shot or starved. Mothers whispered of children taken from their arms. In Silesia, women carried scars and silence from what the Soviets had done. By the spring of 1945, the German people no longer needed propaganda. They had seen the Red Army for themselves. For the soldier trudging westward in worn boots, the calculation became clear. To fight on meant being trapped in the Soviet ring of steel. To stay behind meant death in a forest clearing or worse. To surrender to Americans, those same Americans he had been told were weak, decadent, incapable of war, was the only chance left. Captain Patterson's intelligence reports painted the picture. Entire Wehrmacht units abandoning defensive positions, destroying their own guns and tanks so they could move faster. Some soldiers even fought through SS roadblocks, their own supposed comrades, who tried to stop them from fleeing west. Discipline had dissolved. Fear had taken over. The sheer scale was staggering. In just 1 week, American listening posts detected movements of hundreds of thousands. Refugees and soldiers alike were moving as one vast tide toward the Elbe. 8 million civilians were already on the roads, clogging every path west. The Wehrmacht, once the most disciplined fighting force in Europe, was now indistinguishable from the people it had sworn to defend. And behind them thundered the Red Army, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front. The Soviets advanced 30 kilometers a day. German columns on foot managed 10 at best. The clock was running, and every hour meant the difference between American custody and Soviet captivity. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, once one of Hitler's closest military advisors, later admitted the truth in his final assessment. The maximum number of German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement is complete. It was no longer about fighting. It was no longer about victory. It was about one thing: surviving the end of the Reich. For the men on that shattered bridge at Tangermunde, the choice had already been made. They would risk collapsing beams, SS bullets, and Soviet artillery, all for the chance to hand themselves over to an American private with a rifle and a field kitchen. What they could not know yet was that the Americans were prepared for them, not just with weapons, but with something the Germans had not seen in years: food, medicine, and the rule of law. And so the flood kept moving westward, step after step, toward the unknown. The long road west was not a march of soldiers. It was a slow, ragged procession of human beings. For those fleeing toward the Elbe, survival meant more than just dodging bullets. It meant carrying whatever scraps of daily life they could hold on to as the Reich collapsed around them. A former sergeant of the Wehrmacht recalled years later, "We no longer moved like soldiers. We moved like refugees, each step weighed down not by rifles or packs, but by the fear of being caught by the Russians." Look closely at that flood of humanity, and you'd see the details that never made it into military reports. Food was everything. Men carried crusts of stale bread wrapped in rags, small tins of lard, or a handful of dried peas stuffed in their pockets. Some had slung rabbits or chickens over their shoulders, stolen from farms along the way. Others chewed on sugar beets pulled from muddy fields. When rations ran out, they boiled nettles, roots, or grass, anything to quiet the hunger. Uniforms were coming apart. Boots were worn through, toes poking out, soles tied with wire. Wool coats, once pressed sharp, now hung loose, patched with bits of civilian cloth. Some men had stripped off their insignia, sewing on old work jackets in hopes of looking less like soldiers if the Soviets caught them. Memories carried in pockets. A folded photograph of a wife in Dresden, and a child's toy carved from wood, a pocket watch that no longer kept time. These little things weighed as heavily as rifles once had, because they were the last pieces of home left. Among the soldiers marched civilians, thousands of them. Mothers pushed carts piled with bedding, kettles, and children clinging to the sides. Elderly men leaned on walking sticks, barely able to keep up. Entire families moved west as if the land itself were pushing them forward. The road was not just a military retreat. It was Germany itself, unraveling on the move. And danger was never far. The SS had set up checkpoints on the roads. Deserters caught trying to flee west were shot on the spot, their bodies left hanging from trees with signs around their necks. Traitor. Civilians passed by these grim warnings with lowered eyes, quickening their pace. At night, the refugees huddled in barns, churches, or under the open sky. They lit no fires. Smoke might bring Soviet aircraft. Instead, they shared whatever scraps they had, trading stories in whispers. One man swore that American camps gave prisoners bread and coffee. Another claimed the Americans had hospitals and medicine. To many, it sounded like fantasy. For the average German soldier in that line, the war had shrunk to one question. Could he keep moving one more day? Could his child make it just 10 more miles? Could his boots hold out until he saw the American side of the river? The road to the Elbe was not paved with strategy or orders. It was paved with blistered feet, empty stomachs, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, surrender meant survival. On the western bank of the Elbe, the young Americans of the 102nd Infantry Division watched history unfold. To them, the war in Europe was supposed to be nearly finished. One last push, one last patrol, and then maybe home. What none of them expected was the sight now filling their binoculars, not enemy fire, but endless columns of enemy soldiers walking straight toward them. Captain William Patterson, standing with his field glasses, muttered to his staff, "They're not attacking. They're surrendering." At first, it seemed like a trick. For years, German troops had fought bitterly, to the last bullet, to the last man. But this was different. Entire units approached with white cloths tied to sticks, waving them like farmers offering peace. Officers marched in formation, pistols holstered, their men still in step. But instead of charging, they simply stopped in front of American positions and asked to give themselves up. For the GIs, it was surreal. These were the same Germans who had fought them in Normandy, who had shelled them in the Ardennes, who had ambushed patrols in Belgium. And now here they were, hundreds, then thousands, with their hands up, begging to be taken prisoner. The Americans quickly realized this was no ordinary surrender. Major James Morrison, an operations officer, had studied mass capitulations before. He knew what it meant: food, water, medical care, paperwork, an entire machine of logistics suddenly shifting into high gear. And America had that machine. Each U.S. infantry division came equipped with field kitchens capable of feeding 15,000 men a day. Water trucks carried 5,000 gallons each. Mobile hospitals, complete with surgical units and medicine, stood ready to treat the sick and wounded. Military police units were already trained to process captives: name, rank, serial number, fingerprints, photographs. Every man would generate a dozen forms, each one stamped and filed. The Geneva Convention was not just a treaty. For the Americans, it was standard operating procedure. Prisoners would be fed 2,800 calories a day for working men, 2,000 for non-workers. They would be deloused, vaccinated, given medical screenings to prevent outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. The irony was sharp. Many German soldiers had not eaten that well in months. Their own rations had been cut to starvation levels. They carried lice, infections, stomach parasites, and here, on the far bank of the Elbe, the enemy, these decadent Americans, were preparing to treat them better than their own army ever had. Private First Class Harold Jenkins of Kansas recalled in his diary, "We had crates of Spam, powdered eggs, flour, and coffee lined up. At first we thought it was for us. Then the orders came down, feed them, feed the Germans. Some of the guys cursed about it, but then we saw those men, skin and bones, limping, starving. Most of us stopped complaining after that. For the Americans, it was overwhelming. By nightfall, processing centers filled with thousands. Prisoners lined up in neat rows, some still trying to stand at attention. GIs handed out coffee, bread, and blankets. Medical tents buzzed with activity, doctors treating wounds that had been festering for weeks. The young American soldiers had been trained to fight the Germans, not to care for them. Yet in those first days at the Elbe, they discovered something extraordinary. That victory did not just mean winning battles. It meant proving in action that America was different. On the broken bridge, the Germans kept coming. On the far bank, the Americans kept feeding, recording, and sheltering them. And somewhere in that exchange of bread for surrender, humanity itself broke through the ruins of war. If the road westward was filled with hunger and exhaustion, it was also lined with something far more dangerous, fear of their own comrades. By the spring of 1945, the once proud Wehrmacht was not only collapsing under the weight of the Allied advance, it was tearing itself apart from within. Hitler's orders were clear. Any man retreating without authorization is a traitor. The job of enforcing that order fell to the SS. Along the roads leading to the Elbe, black uniformed detachments set up checkpoints. They stopped retreating soldiers, demanding papers, demanding explanations. Those who couldn't justify their movements, those who admitted they were simply trying to reach the Americans, were dragged to the side of the road. The punishment was swift and public. A young German private later testified, "I saw them hang 3 men from a tree. The sign around their necks read, 'Coward.' We were ordered to march past, to look at them. None of us forgot it." It was a grim spectacle repeated again and again. Deserters shot in ditches. Boys no older than 15 executed for abandoning Volkssturm units. Women in auxiliary uniforms accused of defeatism, beaten in front of the columns. The SS clung to a collapsing ideology with bullets and rope long after the war itself was lost. But fear is a strange thing. It can paralyze or it can break chains. By April, entire formations of Wehrmacht soldiers had begun pushing through these SS barriers by force. Some fired warning shots into the air. Others exchanged real gunfire with their so-called comrades. For them, the calculation was simple. Face a firing squad today, or face the Red Army tomorrow. Either way, the odds of survival were slim, but the American lines to the west offered a sliver of hope. Captain Patterson's men, watching through their binoculars, couldn't see this turmoil in detail, but they could sense it in the frantic way German columns moved. Trucks drove with headlights blazing, ignoring every principle of camouflage. Units arrived in parade formation, almost ceremonial in appearance, but they carried white flags, not battle colors. The collapse of order was visible in small details. Officers who once barked commands now simply walked in silence. Soldiers discarded helmets and rifles along the roadside, trading them for civilian caps or walking sticks. Some even approached American outposts in full-dress uniform, medals polished, as if to surrender with dignity even as their nation fell apart. For the Americans, it was almost unbelievable. Sergeant Robert Thornton of the 2nd Armored Division radioed headquarters. "They're not attacking. They're asking for terms." The Germans were no longer fighting each other for Hitler's collapsing empire. They were fighting each other for the right to surrender. And behind all of it, the clock still ticked. The Soviets were advancing mile by mile, the gunfire from the east growing louder with every passing day. The SS could execute deserters, but they could not stop the tide. The Reich itself was breaking apart, one roadblock at a time. Every step toward the Elbe was haunted by the sound of artillery from the east. The Soviets were coming, and they were coming fast. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front were advancing with a momentum no broken army could resist. Entire Soviet armored spearheads, hundreds of T-34 tanks and self-propelled guns rolled forward at 30 kilometers a day. In some sectors, they moved even faster. The German columns, made up of exhausted soldiers and civilians on foot, could barely manage 10 kilometers in the same time. That simple math spelled disaster. Every sunrise, The Red Army was 20 kilometers closer. Every sunset, the gap between survival and capture shrank. Refugees spoke of hearing the rumble before they saw the tanks, the ground trembling, the sky streaked with rockets, the scream of Stalin's Katyusha launchers pounding villages into rubble. Those who fell behind never reappeared. Stories spread quickly, whole towns erased, civilians cut down, women dragged away. For the Germans moving west, this was not rumor. It was lived terror. General Walter Wenck, commander of the German 12th Army, understood the stakes. When Hitler ordered him to turn east and fight toward Berlin, Wenck made a fateful choice. He told his officers, "The war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living." Instead of wasting his men in a suicidal assault, he turned them west, opening a corridor so civilians and soldiers alike could escape the Soviet trap. That decision saved tens of thousands, but it also meant a desperate race had begun. American observers reported surreal scenes on the roads. German convoys sped forward with headlights blazing, ignoring all rules of camouflage. Some marched in tight formations, almost like a parade, as if discipline itself could protect them. Others moved in chaos, carts and wagons jamming narrow lanes, horses stumbling, families huddled together under sheets of canvas. From above, Soviet aircraft circled like hawks. IL-2, Sturmovik ground attack planes strafed the columns. To the Soviets, these were still enemy troops. Retreating or not, they were targets. Survivors dove into ditches, praying the Americans were still far enough away to be reached. By April 25th, American listening posts estimated nearly 1.2 million Germans, soldiers, civilians, boys, and old men, still east of the Elbe. Only hours remained before the Red Army's iron grip closed. For many, it was a race they knew they couldn't win. But still they ran, because the alternative was unthinkable. One German officer later admitted in his memoir, "We marched not for victory, not for honor, but for the chance to live one more day. Every kilometer westward was another heartbeat of hope." And so, on broken roads, under the roar of Soviet guns, the race for survival thundered toward its climax. At a time when most German generals still mouthed Hitler's empty slogans, one man dared to speak the truth. General Walter Wenck, commander of the German 12th Army, was only 44 years old, the youngest army commander in the Wehrmacht. He was no fanatic. He was a pragmatist, a soldier who could see what his Führer would not. The war was lost, and Berlin was doomed. In late April 1945, as Soviet forces tightened their noose around the capital, Hitler summoned Wenck and gave him one last order. "Turn your army east, break through to Berlin, relieve the city at once." It was madness. Wenck had perhaps 200,000 men under his command, many of them boys in Volkssturm units or old men dragged into uniform. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Facing them were hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops backed by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Sending his men east would not save Berlin. It would only feed them into the slaughterhouse. Wenck made his choice. Gathering his staff officers at his headquarters, he spoke words that none of them expected. "Comrades, the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living, our soldiers and the civilians depending on us." Instead of turning east toward Berlin, Wenck turned west. His goal was no longer victory, but survival. He would attack westward, not against the Americans, but toward them, holding open a corridor through which civilians and retreating soldiers could escape the Soviet steamroller. It was a calculated gamble, and it worked. Under Wenck's orders, the 12th Army became less a fighting force than a shield. His units engaged the Soviets just long enough to keep the corridor open, then fell back, repeating the process again and again. Behind them, tens of thousands of civilians streamed west, women pushing carts, children riding on wagons, wounded soldiers leaning on each other. One witness described the sight as a river of humanity flowing past soldiers who no longer fought for Hitler, but for the chance that others might live. The Soviets, furious at the escape, pounded Venk's rear guard with artillery and aircraft. Entire villages were flattened in the crossfire. But still the 12th Army moved, step by step, holding the door open just long enough for another column of refugees to pass through. By early May, Venk's gamble had allowed as many as 250,000 soldiers and civilians to cross into American lines. Among them were children who would grow up to remember the strange kindness of their former enemies, and soldiers who would later write in disbelief about being fed better in captivity than they had been in their own army. Venk would later be captured by the Americans himself. Unlike many of Hitler's generals, he never glorified those last days. He admitted plainly, it was not courage to fight for a lost cause. The only courage left was to save lives. That single decision, to defy Hitler and march west instead of east, did not change the outcome of the war. But for tens of thousands of Germans who reached the Elbe alive, it meant the difference between death in a Soviet prison camp and survival under American guard. The path to the Elbe was now open, and with it came scenes so extraordinary that even hardened American soldiers could not believe what they were seeing. By the first week of May 1945, the Elbe River had become the stage for one of the most astonishing spectacles of the war. From the eastern horizon, endless columns of men and women poured onto the shattered bridge at Tangamünde. The sight was surreal, part military formation, part civilian exodus, part funeral march for a dying nation. A sergeant from the 102nd Infantry Division recalled, "It looked like a parade gone mad. Soldiers with medals on their tunics walked beside farm women pushing wheelbarrows. Kids carried satchels bigger than themselves, and then whole bands of troops still in formation. Only instead of rifles, some were carrying accordions, violins, even tubas." The Americans had prepared for prisoners. They had not prepared for this. Entire Wehrmacht companies arrived in perfect order, officers saluting as if they were reporting for inspection. One after another, they stacked their rifles neatly, set down machine guns, removed helmets, and placed them in piles. Then they stepped back, hands raised, waiting for American guards to process them. Behind the soldiers came civilians who looked less like an army and more like the broken pieces of German society. Wives, mothers, and daughters in patched coats clutched children to their chests. Elderly men, some still wearing faded medals from World War I, hobbled along with canes. One young woman carried her father's violin, wrapped in cloth, as if music itself might survive where armies had failed. The Americans were struck not only by the numbers but by the variety. There were Luftwaffe ground crews still in blue uniforms, railway workers with grease on their hands, hospital nurses wearing Red Cross armbands. There were even SS men, stripped of their insignia, pretending to be ordinary soldiers in hopes of mercy. One GI remembered watching a group of Hitler youth boys, no older than 15, marching stiffly across the bridge. They tried to keep their chins high, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were just children, suddenly thrust into a world collapsing around them. For the Germans, surrender was not a single act. It was a ritual repeated 1,000 times. Men unbuckled their belts, dropped pistols into piles, and walked forward with empty hands. Some tried to maintain dignity, clicking heels, bowing slightly, saluting officers who no longer held power. Others simply slumped to the ground, too exhausted to care. On the American side, field kitchens smoked with pots of coffee and soup. Prisoners were handed bread, meat, even chocolate. To many Germans, it was their first taste of real food in months. A nurse captured in her diary wrote, "They gave me a cup of coffee. I could not believe it. It was hot, strong, and sweet. I had forgotten such things existed." But perhaps the most striking thing at the Elbe was the silence. For all the thousands crossing, for all the boots clattering against broken beams, the scene carried an almost sacred hush. No victory cheers, no shouted orders, just the quiet shuffle of a defeated people moving toward captivity, toward survival, and toward an uncertain future. For the young American soldiers watching it unfold, it was a sight they would carry with them the rest of their lives. One GI later told his son, "We had fought the Germans for years, but that day, when I saw them crossing the river, they didn't look like the enemy anymore. They just looked human." For many Germans who stumbled across the Elbe, the first true shock of surrender wasn't the sight of American rifles. It was the smell of American food. The GIs had lit their field stoves, and soon the air filled with the aroma of hot coffee, frying bacon, and bread pulled from ovens mounted on trucks. To soldiers who had lived for months on watery soup, dry black bread, and horse meat, the smell alone was overwhelming. One Wehrmacht private recalled years later, "We thought they were playing a trick. They handed us meat, potatoes, butter, and coffee. We believed it was propaganda, meant to fool us. But then we realized it was simply their normal ration." American supply power was unlike anything the Germans could imagine. Every infantry division carried rolling stock of flour, canned meat, powdered milk, and sugar. Army cooks had recipes for biscuits, pancakes, and even chocolate pudding, comfort foods designed to keep morale high. Even in the chaos of May 1945, American soldiers ate better than most German civilians had eaten in years, and they shared it. Captured soldiers sat in rows, cradling steaming mugs of coffee. Some stared in disbelief at their rations. White bread as soft as cake, Spam sliced thick, tins of peaches in syrup. To men who hadn't seen fruit since 1939, it might as well have been a feast. Medical care brought equal astonishment. US medics vaccinated prisoners against typhus and smallpox, cleaned infected wounds, and issued sulfur drugs that German doctors had run out of long ago. Field hospitals were equipped with X-ray machines, surgical tools, and plasma bags that seemed to appear in endless supply. A German nurse captured in the Elbe crossing wrote in her diary, "The Americans gave us bandages, clean and white. They changed our dressings with gloves, with real antiseptic. I had not seen such supplies since before the war." In that moment, I knew we had stepped into another world. It wasn't just food and medicine. It was the small things that stunned the Germans. The cigarettes freely handed out, the chewing gum pressed into children's hands, the candy bars tossed to boys who had been wearing uniforms just days earlier. Even Coca-Cola, carried in crates, appeared at some prisoner camps. To a nation starved of sugar, it was almost magical. The numbers told the larger story. While Germany's supply lines had collapsed, America's were overflowing. By 1945, the US Army was shipping 17 million pounds of food per day to its forces in Europe. The average American GI consumed 4,000 calories daily, nearly double the ration of a German soldier at the front. For the prisoners, it was a revelation. They had been told Americans were weak, undisciplined, too soft to endure hardship. Instead, they discovered a nation so rich in resources that it could afford to feed even its enemies. One German officer summed it up in disbelief. "We had believed we were the master race, and yet here we were, saved by the generosity of men we had called decadent." At that moment, we understood who had truly won the war. At the Elbe, surrender did not taste like humiliation. For many Germans, it tasted like white bread, hot coffee, and the shocking discovery of abundance. Not everyone made it to the Elbe. For hundreds of thousands, the westward flight ended in the forests of Halbe, where survival was measured in minutes. Between April 24th and May 1st, 1945, the Battle of Halbe became one of the most desperate and bloody struggles of the entire war. More than 200,000 German soldiers, along with tens of thousands of civilians, were trapped in a tightening pocket between the Soviet 1st Ukrainian and 1st Belarusian fronts. Their only hope was to break west through swamp, forest, and fire, to reach American lines before the Soviets crushed them. It was a nightmare of destruction. Soviet artillery opened up day and night, filling the air with howling shells that shredded trees and bodies alike. Whole villages disappeared in sheets of fire. German columns tried to move through the woods, but Soviet Katyusha rockets ripped them apart, scattering men and horses in bloody fragments. For the civilians caught inside, the horror was indescribable. Mothers clutched children to their chests as shells tore through the trees. Families huddled in ditches, praying the barrage would pass, only to be hit by strafing Soviet aircraft. Men carried the wounded on makeshift stretchers, only to abandon them when the pace became impossible. The fighting was savage, hand to hand. German units tried to punch through Soviet roadblocks, attacking with bayonets and grenades. The Soviets responded with machine guns at point-blank range. Forest paths became rivers of blood. At one crossroads, entire battalions were cut down in open fields before they had advanced 50 yards. A survivor later wrote, "We marched over our own dead. There was no other path. The ground itself was made of bodies." And then there were the executions. Soviet troops, enraged by years of German brutality in the East, showed no mercy. Prisoners were often shot on the spot. Civilians were dragged from hiding places, women assaulted, homes burned. For those who had prayed for capture, capture itself became another form of death. By the time the Halby pocket collapsed, the numbers were staggering. Of the more than 200,000 Germans who tried to break out, barely 40,000 reached American lines. The rest, over 160,000 soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner by the Soviets. Many of those prisoners would never return. The contrast could not have been sharper. At the Elbe, surrender meant bread, coffee, and blankets. At Halbe, surrender meant death in the mud or a cattle car to Siberia. The Germans who survived Halbe carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it openly, most did not. But every man who saw the Elbe crossings knew one terrible truth. The difference between life and death in 1945 was measured not by courage or loyalty, but by which direction you ran when the Reich collapsed. History can be told with numbers, maps, and strategies. But sometimes the truest picture comes from the words of those who lived it. The Germans who crossed the Elbe and surrendered to the Americans left behind a remarkable record: hidden diaries, letters smuggled home, and memoirs written years later. They all tell the same story: shock, disbelief, and a slow realization that everything they had been taught was a lie. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, a decorated veteran of North Africa, wrote in his diary after arriving in American custody, "They fed us white bread and meat more than I had eaten in months. I thought it was a trick, that they meant to poison us. But the guards ate the same food. I realized then this was simply their way of life." Sergeant Hans Meyer, captured near Tungamunda, wrote home after 6 months in a U.S. POW camp in Texas. "We are given 3 meals a day. There is coffee, milk, and butter. I work in the fields but am paid in cigarettes and chocolate. I cannot understand it. We had been told America was weak, divided, decadent. Yet here I live better as a prisoner than I did as a free soldier in Germany." The shock wasn't only material, it was moral. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as mongrels, incapable of discipline, ruled by Jewish conspirators. Yet German POWs discovered something else: guards who treated them with fairness, medics who cleaned their wounds, cooks who shared their own rations. Corporal Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian aristocrat whose family had served the German army for generations, confessed in his post-war memoir, "As our ship approached the American coast, I saw radar spinning above a cargo vessel. A cargo vessel. We had believed only our most advanced warships had such technology. It was then I knew we had been deceived, not by the Americans, but by our own leaders." Ordinary soldiers echoed the same feeling. A 19-year-old Volkssturm recruit, barely a boy, later remembered, "They gave me chewing gum. I had never seen such a thing. I chewed it for hours, not knowing you were not supposed to swallow it." That small gift destroyed more of Hitler's lies than any battlefield defeat. The testimonies reveal a pattern: astonishment at abundance, gratitude for kindness, and finally, the collapse of Nazi belief. Not all Germans were treated equally. SS men, once identified, were separated and interrogated. But for the average soldier, the experience of American captivity was less about punishment and more about survival. One nurse wrote simply, "In the American camp, I was not afraid at night. That was enough." For the Germans who survived the Elbe, these moments became turning points. They had lost a war. They had lost their nation. But in that loss, they glimpsed something else, an idea of freedom, democracy, and prosperity that their own leaders had promised could not exist. The witnesses remind us, sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with bullets, but with bread, coffee, and the quiet power of human decency. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The guns fell silent. The Reich that had once promised 1,000 years was gone after just 12. But for the men and women who crossed the Elbe River in those final days, surrender had come earlier, on a broken bridge, in a desperate march westward, in a mug of coffee pressed into their hands by an American GI. Looking back, the meaning of that moment is clear. The Germans had fled not toward Hitler, not toward Berlin, not even toward survival in their own homeland. They had fled toward the Americans, because even in defeat, they saw something they had never known: abundance without cruelty, discipline without terror, and victory without vengeance. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, Elbe, a forest of death, where 160,000 perished in mud and fire. On the other, the Elbe, a bridge where hundreds of thousands found a second chance at life. The difference was not in courage or strategy or even fate. The difference was in who stood waiting on the far bank. For the Americans, it was never just about firepower. Yes, industry had built more tanks, more planes, more ships than the Axis could dream of. Yes, logistics had delivered mountains of supplies across oceans. But in the end, America's true power was something harder to measure: its ability to combine strength with mercy. The witnesses remembered it for the rest of their lives: a slice of white bread, a cigarette, a nurse with clean bandages, a guard who treated them not as animals, but as men. These small moments broke the chains of propaganda more completely than any battlefield victory. General Walter Wenck had told his officers, "Our duty is to the living." That duty was fulfilled not by the Reich, but by the very nation it had tried to destroy. For older Germans who survived captivity, that realization shaped the rest of their lives. For younger ones, it planted seeds of doubt that grew into something stronger, a willingness to rebuild, not in the image of Hitler's Reich, but in the image of freedom they had glimpsed in American hands. And for the Americans who stood on that riverbank in 1945, the memory never faded. They had expected to fight. Instead, they witnessed one of the greatest mass surrenders in history, and learned that sometimes the true measure of victory is not how many enemies you defeat, but how many lives you save. The broken bridge at Tangermunde is gone now, replaced by steel and concrete. But in memory, it still stands, a symbol of the day when an army chose surrender over destruction, when survival meant crossing a river, and when America showed the world not just its strength, but its heart. If you believe this story deserves to be remembered, please like and subscribe, so that the voices of those who crossed the Elbe and those who welcomed them are never forgotten. History is filled with moments like this, stories that deserve to be remembered and passed down. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story struck you the most? Share it in the comments below. And if you want to join us for more untold tales of World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Together, we'll keep these memories alive.